Okay, thank you very much, Tamiru, and thank you all for coming. What I'm going to take you through today relates obviously to the Earth, but in this picture, I just chose this picture because I think it's a fantastic animation of the Earth. What we're going to speak about is just the crust and aspects of crustal formation. So we're just going to be looking at this very thin outer layer of Earth. And I have to say that this is not only my work. This is a paper we've recently published with the lead author Emily Chin from Scripps and Kai Shimizu from DTM. So it's a really good collaboration that we have together. And it all started actually by discussing these ideas at a conference, at a Gordon Research Conference, a really excellent small conference where idea generation is the main goal. And so if you ever get a chance to go to a Gordon Research Conference, I would highly recommend it. And I think it's a good idea also to tell funders that conferences actually generate ideas. This came straight out of ideas over a coffee at a conference. Right, so I'm going to speak about the continental crust and subduction predominantly. And as you may or may not know, the continental crust is generated predominantly in subduction zones. So the vast majority of the crust on which we live is generated in arc environments. And surprisingly, it's obviously very important for life, especially land-based life. But surprisingly, there's some fundamental issues that we don't understand about the formation of the continental crust. And that's going to be the fundamental topic for the discussion today. And so here you see a sort of a typical cross-section of subduction. It makes it look like oceanic crust formation is very simple because there's no labels and details there, but it turns out to be much more complicated. But of course, the subduction zone adds extra layers of complexity because you're taking hydrated oceanic crust and subducting it into the mantle, dehydrating it, setting up convection cells in the mantle wedge, and you are forming crust that is much more evolved. And that has most certainly an effect on the magmas that you see that erupt in arc environments and that therefore form the continental crust. And the main aspect that we're not really sure of around the continental crust is this crustal dichotomy. So broadly speaking, the oceanic crust is basaltic, and the continental crust is, or the arc crust in general, and because most of the continental crust is formed in arc environments, the continental crust in general is andesitic. And this has been a fundamental problem for petrologists and geochemists since almost the time of bone, right? And even though the crust is so important, we still don't fully understand why there is this dichotomy. And this is how that dichotomy presents. This is a typical AFM ternary diagram, and all the data you see here in the gray dots for arc crust and oceanic crust is sourced from GeoRock databases, so thousands and thousands of measurements, in this case of arc crust, and in this case of oceanic crust. Overlaid on that are experimental melt compositions from andesitic arc crust and from experiments involving synthesis of oceanic melts. And the fundamental difference you see here is that oceanic crust in general displays ion enrichment. So if you go from parental melts that would sit somewhere over here, potentially, and as you sample more and more of this crust, you notice that there is an ion enrichment, all right, towards F here, which represents iron, M is magnesium, and A stands for sodium and potassium. So oceanic crust shows this fundamental ion enrichment. When you look at arc crust, you notice something fundamentally different. It starts off on that ion enrichment trend, but as you move to more differentiated rocks, you see a very strong ion depletion or enrichment in sodium and potassium. But really it's couched in the fact that this is an ion depletion when you start looking at more differentiated arc crust. Of course, this manifests in oceanic crust being basaltic and arc crust being andesitic. And these two different trends are the subject of this talk. The first is the Tholeiitic trend, which characterizes oceanic crusts, as you can see, with ion enrichment. And in the arc environment, we see this Calc-alkaline trend, which is characterized by iron depletion. And those two different trends are the fundamental controversy that I'm going to hopefully help or shed some more light on in this lecture. And these are observations, these two different trends are observations that petrologists for generations have made and have failed to really shed much light on it. And I'm going to explain the main reason. So the main controversy relating to the origin of these two trends is whether that iron enrichment, and more specifically the iron depletion in arc environments, is a signal of the source that's melting to form the continental crust, or is it a signal that's derived from differentiation? So is it a signal that derives from differentiation within the crust itself? As these magmas rise from the mantle wedge, is it a signal that derives from differentiation here? Or is it a signal derived from the oceanic crust dehydrating, providing material to the mantle wedge, and then that being the source of that iron depletion? And so you can see petrologists through the ages have dealt with this. Is it a mantle source? Is it purely magmatic fractionation or fractional crystallization? That's what Norman Bowen said in 1928. Or is it contamination and mixing with crustal material? So these are some of the lines of evidence for the source signal hypotheses. So what makes some scientists suggest that this iron depletion or the calc-alkaline trend is due to the source being involved? The first is that these magmas have elevated water contents, they have higher oxygen fugacities, and that may be derived from hydrated and oxidized slab material. You could also derive that trend from mantle wedge melt rock reaction, from mantle wedge oxidation, state variation with changes in potential temperature in the mantle wedge, or just variations in the melting regime. Evidence against the source or differentiation-derived hypotheses suggests that when you look at redox-sensitive element compositions in arc magmas, as well as iron isotope compositions, all which should be able to fingerprint differences in oxygen fugacity really well, they have almost identical oxygen fugacity to mid-ocean ridge basalts. So that is, in some people's eyes, evidence against source derivation. Another way of changing the oxygen fugacity is through shallow level degassing of water. That could change the oxygen fugacity of these magmas that erupt in arc environments. And as we'll see later, something that may be important is there could be tectonic controls on differentiation. Maybe crustal thickness, maybe the regime in which this arc magmatism is operating. Another reason for the controversy is all those points that I showed you on the AFM diagram. All of them are erupted or very shallow level plutonic rocks. All right? So by their very nature, they have already traveled through the entire crustal column. If you're in a continental arc, that could be 50, 60, 80 kilometers thick. In an island arc, it's shallow, 20, 30 kilometers. But these magmas from their generation zone in the mantle wedge have traveled up through some crust and no doubt have experienced some differentiation. And so our view of those two different trends is partially clouded by some differentiation or some idea that those compositions could have changed. Of course, that's not really the case for mid-ocean ridge basalts because there isn't a large crustal column through which those magmas have to transgress to erupt. And we know that in these kinds of crustal columns, the lower crust, the lower to mid crust, which is known as the hot zone or mash zone, tends to be where a lot of the differentiation happens. And so a big part of the controversy is whether all these signals we see, these trends, the calc-alkaline and tholeiitic trends, are derived or obscured in some way from differentiation in the crust. So what we decided to do was to try and see through those shallow crustal processes by looking at deep crustal cumulates. And effectively what these are magmatic rocks that have crystallized around the moho or in the deepest parts of the lower crust and have been brought up as xenoliths in the magmas that erupt on the surface. And surprisingly, when you go around the world, you find a lot of mantle xenoliths, but you also find a lot of these deep crustal cumulates. they're not always the same age as the magmatism that brings them to the surface, but they certainly look cumulate in their textural modalities. And I'll show you a few examples of that. So what we hoped to do in this study was to get a complementary crystal view to the erupted perspective, to say, well, let's try to look through all those obfuscations or confusions that may be caused by differentiation in the shallow crust and see if we can get a better view as to the source of the calc-alkaline and tholeiitic rocks. So to do that, we did not go to all these places. We scoured the literature effectively and just looked for occurrences, reports of magmatic cumulates that have been brought to the surface. And we focused for now on mid-ocean ridge environments and island arcs and continental arcs. And so we have a large database, over 500 major element analyses from different parts of the world, and that's what I'm going to show you and focus on today. This is what some of those crustal cumulates look like. The top half of the image here is taken from a xenolith locality or cumulate locality in Big Creek, Sierra Nevada, so a continental arc, and you see websterites and garnet-bearing clinopyroxenites. These are clearly cumulates that form deep within an orogenic environment. And here you see a sketch that Emily Chin produced showing where some of these crustal cumulates may be derived from. So websterites are coming from below the petrologic moho, and these pyroxenites, based on geobarometry and a variety of other thermobarometric techniques, are coming from above the petrologic moho. And you can see they have typical cumulate textures. This is more clear in this sample. These come from the Pacific Rise, and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the Pacific Rise, and are effectively gabbros. So these are shallower differentiation products. You can see clinopyroxene oikocrysts. You can see a weak foliation in the sample, or fabric in the sample. And so these would be, by all accounts, considered cumulate rocks, but they're coming from close to the moho, in this case in a continental arc, in this case in a ridge environment. So if we now overlay these cumulate compositions on top of, first of all, mid-ocean ridge basalt compositions, you see that the tholeiitic trend is replicated in these deep crustal cumulates. That was the first comforting result, that the cumulate compositions match, or at least replicate in their trend, this iron depletion. However, you'll notice some differences. The first is that the most primitive of these cumulates extend to much higher magnesium number and are much more iron depleted, much more primitive. If I then move on to the arc environments, you'll see that once again we see in the arc environment the beginning of the calc-alkaline trend developing with iron depletion, but the majority of the samples are far more enriched in iron and magnesium than the majority of the calc-alkaline magmatic trend. Okay? Just to re-emphasize again that what you see here in the small squares and the pluses, these are experimental melts generated in a lab, cook and look experiments, and in the squares you see experimental cumulates. And what's encouraging is that the cumulate compositions match relatively well with our observed cumulates around the world, and the same occurs more or less in the mid-ocean ridge environment. So the tholeiitic and calc-alkaline trends are reflected in iron-poor mid-ocean ridge cumulates and iron-rich arc cumulates. So what you're seeing is a complementary reservoir to the calc-alkaline and tholeiitic trend. That's exactly what we'd expect, right? You'd expect to see, in cumulates formed at mid-ocean ridges, you'd expect to see iron depletion because there's an iron enrichment in the lavas, and in the arc environments you expect to see iron enrichment because the lavas show an iron depletion. So they're complementary reservoirs. The reason I tell you about this now is in the next plot you're going to see the experimental cumulate composition overlain over the natural cumulates with some MELTS modeling. And we did alphaMELTS modeling to try and create baseline reference models to make sure that what we were seeing represented some degree of reality, or at least be able to cross-check our cumulate evolution trends. And so for those of you who may be interested in MELTS modeling, we considered two different model scenarios, one to replicate fractional crystallization in a mid-ocean ridge environment, and the other fractional crystallization in an arc environment. The main difference, so that you don't have to read all this text, is that obviously the arc environment has additional water added to it, and we have changed the oxygen fugacity in these models to be a lower estimate for the arc environment. Okay, so I'm not going to show you all the different element trends, but we're just going to go through some poignant ones, and let's just try to break this diagram down. So here we have on the x-axis for these different environments, we have magnesium number, a measure of the primitiveness of the system, in these two columns here. The first for mid-ocean ridges, and the second for arcs. Right, in this last column, we're comparing mid-ocean ridges in gray with island arcs and continental arcs. So let's start with the mid-ocean ridge environment. In the mid-ocean ridge environment, you see a very good correlation between the MELTS model for a variety of elements and the observed cumulate array, which once again overlaps very nicely with experimentally derived cumulates. The numbers here on these red lines, the red lines, by the way, represent the MELTS model, and the numbers here are the degree of fractional crystallization. You'll notice for the mid-ocean ridge samples, there is a fairly tight array. Okay, and that's because there's far fewer processes that are altering or changing the chemistry of these samples in that particular tectonic environment. If we look at the arc system, over here you can see a much greater scatter in the data, less adherence to the MELTS model, so clearly there are some other factors at play which are altering these compositions. And you can see what I've overlain here with the black lines is the actual field that would be defined for the mid-ocean ridge cumulates. So you can see that there is a much bigger scatter. But some of the things that we expect to be happening at mid-ocean ridges versus arcs, you can clearly see. So you can see that there's a significant difference in aluminium concentration. So if you compare on this last column, mid-ocean ridges with island arcs and continental arcs, you'll see, for instance, that silicon doesn't show very much difference. It's fairly variable. But you see significant differences in aluminium and in calcium. And so here, for example, in the mid-ocean ridge environment, you notice that the median value for very primitive mid-ocean ridge cumulates, everything you see here is cumulate data, the most magnesium-rich or primitive cumulates have much higher aluminium content in mid-ocean ridges than in arc environments. Okay, you may say that's kind of weird. Why would that be? And it's known that in these environments, plagioclase saturates early. Plagioclase crystallizes in mid-ocean ridges much earlier than in arc environments, and so you can see that as a function of this graph over here. You can then see as arcs evolve, in terms of the magnesium number, the amount of plagioclase crystallizing at these depths picks up. The elevated calcium, you can see there's a difference between calcium concentrations, particularly in arc environments compared to mid-ocean ridge environments, and that's predominantly due to the role that clinopyroxene plays prominently in deeper continental arc environments. But for us, what was most distinct when comparing cumulates from these different tectonic environments is the iron and titanium compositions. So here you see evolution of iron and titanium within these cumulates. You can see there's a very good adherence in the mid-ocean ridge MELTS model with the actual cumulate data, and the same thing with the titanium data. Not as good in the island arc example, a bit more scatter. But what you notice is that there are fundamental differences in the iron and titanium composition of island arc and continental arc cumulates compared with mid-ocean ridge cumulates. So what you see here is that the median iron composition in continental arcs, indicated in yellow here, for the most primitive samples, is 10 weight percent, whereas in mid-ocean ridges it's 6 weight percent. That's a significant difference in iron, total iron. You'll notice in titanium the differences are less easy to discern on this diagram, but 0.89 weight percent titanium in continental arcs versus 0.4 weight percent in mid-ocean ridges. Obviously, island arcs are intermediate to those different environments, and so you see intermediate median iron and titanium compositions. So arc cumulates are substantially more enriched in total iron and titanium compared with mid-ocean ridges. And this is significant, and it speaks to the debate about the origin of the continental crust and those two different trends. So what I've shown here is a diagram showing the concentration of these 5 elements normalized to a primitive arc basalt, comparing upper continental crusts and mid-ocean ridge cumulates with cumulates from island arcs and from continental arcs. And what you see all over the globe, so all these are different locations around the globe, what you see is that iron and titanium enrichment in arc cumulates is a global feature. All right? In addition, iron and titanium enrichment is highest, as I showed you on the previous graph, in continental arc cumulates. That's the fundamental relationship that we need to try and describe. It's also important because you notice, for instance, that the continental crust itself, as an average, is depleted in iron, right? Relative to the magma, this primitive arc basalt that we want to form the continental arc with. Why is that? Why should it be the overall continental crust be depleted relative to the magma that forms it? This is a fundamental conundrum that's puzzled geochemists for a long time and relates to the Calc-alkaline and Tholeiitic trend debate as well. And what you see, especially in all arc cumulates effectively, but especially in the continental arc cumulates, is that there is a complementary enrichment in iron that you see in these arc environments. And does that, and can that explain, for instance, why the upper continental crust is depleted? Or could these cumulates be a complementary reservoir to this depleted upper continental crust? So what causes this? What causes this enrichment in iron and to some degree in titanium, as you can see here, compared to upper continental crust and mid-ocean ridges? One option, especially for continental arcs that get to the depth that's required to form garnet, is that garnet is sequestering iron as these cumulates form and creating this enrichment you see in the cumulates and therefore the depletion in the upper continental crust. However, that can't be the only reason, because whilst continental arcs can get deep enough to saturate primary garnet or create metamorphic garnet, you see an enrichment in iron, particularly in island arcs as well. And those do not, in general, get to the depths that would be able to stabilize garnet magmatically. And so it can't only be garnet formation that is depleting these primitive arc basalts in iron. And so another major contender is magnetite or spinel. That's going to deplete, if you're crystallizing magnetite and spinel as deep crustal cumulates, that is going to sequester iron and to some degree titanium in the structure and cause a depletion in the upper continental crust. And you don't need a lot of iron titanium oxide to do this. So to be able to create this kind of depletion that matches what you see in the upper continental crust, we calculate that you only need 2% modal amount in the cumulate to create a magma that has this low iron content. So to summarize this diagram, we see high iron and titanium concentrations, and this must be a signal of early and continuous precipitation of these minerals in the evolution of the arc magmas. So this speaks somewhat to what Norman Bowen was saying. He was suggesting that fractional crystallization, i.e. of these cumulative rocks at the Moho, is the most important component in creating these two different trends. And we agree with that. iron titanium oxide saturation is crucial. It's the only thing that's going to create the enrichment both in island arcs and continental arcs. And you don't see that in mid-ocean ridge cumulates because the oxides do not saturate early in mid-ocean ridge cumulates. They only saturate once you get to magnesium numbers of around 55. But once again, what causes that early and continuous saturation in magnetite or iron titanium oxide? There still has to be something in the magma system that causes that saturation. And so the question just goes deeper. Is it magma source or subsequent differentiation which creates that early saturation? And I think this is the crucial message here, is that when you look at the median iron content of these cumulates, especially in arc environments, and here you see the iron concentration in mid-ocean ridge cumulates compared with the iron concentration in island arc cumulates in blue and continental arc cumulates in yellow. Now note that what we're comparing these iron concentrations here is to crustal thickness, and all of these depth estimates are based on either seismic reflection or refraction profiles, xenolith thermobarometry, or in some cases where the arc section is actually exposed on the surface, like in Talkeetna and Kohistan, actually measuring the entire arc section. So I mentioned earlier that most of these deep cumulates come from effectively xenoliths brought up in pulses of lava later on, but some of these come from arc sections that are exposed on the surface of the Earth. It's probably about 3 or 4 of them that exist. And what you notice here is that with increasing crustal thickness, these deep arc cumulates become more enriched in iron. And this is a fundamental relationship that we see in this data set. And that suggests, and so there's a fundamental correlation between iron concentration and crustal thickness. You also see differences, clear differences, between the iron content in island arcs and the iron content in continental arcs. And what this suggests is that in continental arcs, you may have an earlier saturation of an iron-rich phase. It could be an oxide, or it could be garnet. And so it's not just this study that's shown that. So there are at least 2 other studies that we know of that show a relationship between crustal thickness and iron content. In these 2 examples, we're not looking at iron content in the cumulates. We're looking at iron content in the erupted lavas. So whilst I've shown you an increasing iron content in the cumulates with depth, in these 2 papers, which looked at lava compositions or shallow plutonic rocks, you see as the crust becomes thicker, there's an iron depletion. And so you see that in the Sierra Nevada, and you see that in several other places, where as the crust becomes thicker, the lavas show iron depletion, and we've shown that the cumulates, because they're a complementary reservoir, show iron enrichment. So what causes that? And we'll get to that. But first, and the real key point here, is that this suggests to us that there's a key relationship, not between something happening in the downgoing slab, but rather something in the overriding plate. So it's the crustal thickness which seems to be creating differences in cumulate and magma compositions. And so that immediately suggests that all the source models are not as robust as they may seem, right? Because there's clearly a control in crustal thickness which has to do with the overriding plate. But we said that it looks like oxides are forming early. So let's discuss a little bit what may cause early oxide precipitation. We know that this is causing the iron enrichment trends in our cumulates, this early precipitation of oxides and maybe some garnet in the deeper arcs. But is this caused by oxygen fugacity or the water content? And there's lots of studies that show that the water content of a magma plays an important role in precipitating oxides early on and creating the iron enrichment. Just to test this, and many people have done this, we used melts to look at the effect of water content in changing the iron content of the cumulates and in changing the modal percentage of spinel, for instance, in the magmas. And what you can see, if you look based on magnesium number, anhydrous magma shows this trend in iron content as you crystallize and lower the magnesium number. But as soon as you add water into that mix, you jack up the iron concentration dramatically by several weight percent. And it's almost invariable on the amount of water that you add into that magma. So hydrous melts produce early high magnesium cumulates with much higher iron than anhydrous magmas you'd find at mid-ocean ridge basalts. In addition, and linked to that, is that if you increase the water content, you also stabilize more spinel in the primitive cumulates, and that's what you see here. So as you increase the water content from 1 weight percent to 4 weight percent, even in the most primitive cumulates, you increase the amount of spinel that you crystallize. So there is clearly a relationship here with early oxide formation and water. But there is also a relationship between water content and oxygen fugacity, effectively, or the ratio of Fe3+ to total iron. And so these data come from melt inclusions, and what you see here is the weight percent of water versus this measure of oxygen fugacity, or the amount of iron 3+. And what you see is a strong relationship between the two that is dependent on where these melt inclusions are found. Are they in mid-ocean ridge basalt or arc environments? And so effectively you have a correlation between water content, iron content, and depth. But can we really only suggest that water is causing this enrichment? Because water is not a very good oxidizer, as many different experimental studies have shown. But we have to bear something in mind. Water and Fe3+ in silicate melts are incompatible. And so one of the working hypotheses, or the model we developed to explain this correlation between iron content, depth, and water content, and potentially the oxygen fugacity of the magma, is it possible that the degree of melting is modulated by the crustal thickness, the overlying crustal thickness? Because we know there's a relationship now between iron and crustal thickness. And so there are some studies that exist that show that crustal thickness modulates the degree of melting that occurs in the mantle wedge. And so in these three diagrams, you see the mantle melt rate, the crustal thickness under the arc, and the distance to the trench. What this study was showing, in addition to the degree of melting, was that actually arc fronts migrate depending on lithospheric thickening. And so you see in red, in all these graphs, a tectonic thickening regime. And you'll notice that in these environments, where the crust becomes thicker, the amount of melting decreases dramatically in the time span of an arc. Whereas in the other environments, it doesn't. And eventually, if you thicken your crust enough, the melting shuts off. It's also interesting because when you have an environment where there's no tectonic forcing, and to some extent where there's maybe extensional thinning within the arc environment, you find that magmatism can be much more long-lived. Okay. But certainly when you start to thicken the arc crust, you start to cut off the melt rate and the amount of melting and the degree of melting, therefore, but you also move the arc front as well. And so crustal thickness does, in fact, modulate the degree of melting. And I should point out that these are numerical models, but they also correlate with magma chemistry. So if you look at incompatible element ratios over time in an arc, you see variations that correspond with a decrease in the amount of melting as the crust thickens. So it's based on chemistry as well as numerical modeling. And that's exactly what this diagram is attempting to show here. That as you start to develop a deeper root, you inhibit the degree of melting that can occur. And so our working model to explain these different trends is that there's a fundamental observation, first of all, and that is that there is an observed relationship between crustal thickness and the iron content of deep cumulates. And this suggests that crustal thickness may regulate the degree of melting, and thus the primary water and iron contents of the magmas. Because if you reduce the degree of melting by thickening the crust, water and Fe3 plus and silicate magmas are incompatible, and so in the cumulates you will you will enrich iron and water to some extent more, but in the lavas that erupt from that, you'll have a dramatic depletion in iron and water contents. And that's exactly what we see in these calc-alkaline and tholeiitic trends. So fractional crystallization, particularly of oxides, but also of garnet, is an operative process in creating the calc-alkaline and tholeiitic trends. We've shown that there is an iron-rich cumulate reservoir in the form of these deep magmatic cumulates that balances the iron depletion in the upper continental crust, and that crustal thickness may modulate the degree of mantle melting, and that has a fundamental control on the water content and the iron content of primitive arc-MELTS. And that's exactly what these sketches are showing. So here in a thicker continental crust we have a low degree of partial melting, whereas in island arcs and mid-ocean ridges we see higher degrees of partial melting. And if you have higher degrees of partial melting, you can enrich the subsequent melts in iron, whereas in the calc-alkaline trend, the lower degree of partial melting means that those magmas that erupt get depleted in iron because the degree of partial melting is lower, and thus the cumulates are enriched in iron. There is also, just to end off with, an interesting corroboration that was published, I think, a few months ago or a week ago, and that comes from trace elements, particularly in arc magmas and deep cumulates. And the authors of this paper decided to call these deep cumulates arclogites, which is a bit of a strange word and probably not appropriate or responsible to quote again. But they were looking at the niobium and tantalum concentrations in arc magmas versus deep cumulates. And the reason why they were doing that is because for a long time people have recognized, just like iron is depleted in the upper continental crust, there is also a subchondritic or a depleted niobium tantalum ratio in both mid-ocean ridge basalts and the upper continental crust. And what they showed is that arc magmas show variations in niobium tantalum, but always depletions depending on crustal thickness. So once again we see another correlation between incompatible elements and crustal thickness. And when they measured the niobium tantalum ratios in these deep cumulates, they found that they were enriched in niobium, an incompatible element, relative to the primitive basalts that formed them, and therefore can effectively act as the missing niobium reservoir on Earth. So the important take home here is that we don't only see this in major elements, we see this in incompatible trace element ratios as well. Niobium tantalum fractionation varies with crustal thickness, and the lowest niobium tantalum ratios are seen in the continental arc magmas with the thickest crust, and that is because we've segregated, sequestered rutile-bearing, therefore niobium-bearing cumulates at the base of these thickened arc sections. These ultimately will delaminate back into the mantle because of the density, and so very often we don't see these anymore except for these magmas that are brought up or in these arc sections. So that in many ways corroborates the major element data we've extracted from the literature, showing that rutile-bearing deep crustal cumulates explain several different kinds of geochemical trends that have puzzled petrologists for a long time. So what are the next steps? Because this is actually a really interesting evolving project, and so the next step is to expand our major element database and to include cumulates not just from mid-ocean ridge environments and arc environments, but also from ocean islands, flood basalts, and some other settings, including layered intrusions, because those are very different environments of formation. Like, you can think of it as active versus passive cumulates, if you like. in some ways. And so to look at differences, not just in two tectonic settings, but as you can see in this diagram, in many different places where magmatism influences crustal composition. And then, to follow up from that, we are beginning to collect all these samples from various people that have published on them over the years, and we plan to look at a full set of trace elements, mineral chemistry, element mapping, as well as a range of isotopic work on these samples, because what we have here is a reservoir which we don't often see at the surface and is often sequestered or delaminated back into the mantle. And so it could form a complementary reservoir to the many reservoirs that we know about on Earth. And that, just if there's any students in the audience, that is the project, which now involves a whole range of other people and has been funded by the NRF. So if this science interests you, then please come and speak to me afterwards, because there are several projects that we can develop on this with collaborators from around the world, including Woods Hole, Scripps, UJ, DTM, and here at Wits. So with that, I will take your questions. You can start with it. It's fine. Don't worry.
Two questions, one more general, one more specific.
Yeah.
We know what it means when rocks form from melts.
Mm-hmm.
How cumulates form is a bit more ambiguous, because accumulates the restites from partial melt extraction, or are they just accumulation of minerals which would then control, for instance, iron content? So that would explain why these accumulates may be, enriched in iron. So maybe you can just clarify for the audience how cumulates actually form. Are there different mechanisms? So that's one thing.
Yeah.
And the second question is, it is known that especially in arc settings, water controls the stability of amphiboles. And amphiboles are rich in titanium and iron. So to what extent would you think does amphibole, which is controlled by water, control iron and titanium enrichment or depletion in oxides?
Okay, so let's deal with the first question. You're completely correct that you can get cumulate rocks through different processes simply than accumulation or fractional crystallization. What we tried to do in this data set was to restrict that to crust-forming environments or locations where crust formation had occurred, and we were confident that there was magmatic activity at some point, and so as best we could in those papers look at the textural setting of those samples. So do they show magmatic textures? Yeah, does that answer that part of the question?
To some extent.
Yeah.
I mean, CNOs often, they're isolated, they're brought up in postdocs, and their heterological context is often lost. So I would imagine that it's quite difficult to figure out how cumulate really form, whether it's.
I think what may partially answer your question is that both looking at experimental cumulates, MELTS modeling, and exposed arc sections where there's undeniably a crystal fractionation and a magmatic environment, all those three different things match up. When you combine that with textural work and the locations of those environments, I think you have a good handle on whether that they're actually magmatic and not restitic. And the second part of your question was about amphibole.
And control of water on amphiboles.
Sure.
And how that would influence iron titanium enrichment or depletion process.
Sure, there's no doubt an influence of that. And I can't remember offhand in the MELTS modeling when amphibole saturates, but it's certainly not very early in the evolution of those magnets. In addition, MELTS is not very good at modeling amphibole because it's a complicated mineral to do thermodynamics on. But it certainly could play a role, just as we think that garnet in some environments plays an important role as well. But you mentioned that water content is important, and we think that there's a fundamental control on water content from the crustal thickness aspect. And so, yes, you're right, water content plays a role, but it's the overlying regime that's controlling that, not a source component. Ben.
My question is similar to Robert's first question. But do you see any evidence that there's the early saturation of iron titanium phases in cumulates on all environments?
Yeah, you do. So if you look into those data sets, there is modal iron titanium oxides in all those arc cumulates. Yeah.
Evidence in the sample
Yeah.
results?
Dylan?
Do you think pressure plays any role? Because magnetite will start crystallizing earlier. The pressure is higher under a thick crust.
Yeah, certainly. That could definitely play a role. No doubt. I think one of the take homes from this as well is that it's not as simple as pure fractional crystallization or source. Right? If you have a deep arc, you have garnet. There could be amphibole variations that reflect water content of the primary melt as well. And so clearly it's a more complicated answer to the calc-alkaline trend than simply fractional crystallization or source. Incidentally, we didn't model that in the MELTS modeling, we just did it isobarically, so maybe that's something for the future. Any other questions? If not, then I will introduce next week's speaker who's sitting in the audience and is a new member of staff, Matt Brayshaw, who will be speaking about the structural evolution and architecture of the Charuk belt in Rosh Pina. So we look forward to that. And thank you to John Hancock for the drinks and chips, and for Matt for putting them out, and for all of you for coming.
Thank you.
Cheers.